Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello everyone and welcome to Work in Progress, the Personal Productivity Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. Let's get started. Hi everyone and welcome. I am your host Tia Harmer and today we are going to be discussing the science of sleep and how this affects your personal productivity. I'm here with Dr. Nicole Moshfegh. Nicole, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. So before we start, you've had a very interesting professional life. So for those who don't know you, do you mind explaining a bit about who you are and what it is you do?
Absolutely. So I am a licensed clinical psychologist, and I primarily treat people who are experiencing difficulties with sleep. Typically, it's insomnia. As well as people who are experiencing difficulty with burnout and stress, in particular, high achieving women, overachieving women, typically doctors, lawyers, engineers, and people of color who might be facing also some racism related stress and things of that nature. And so I work on trauma as well as anxiety, stress, burnout, and of course, sleep.
Wow, that is a seriously broad profession. Just out of curiosity, during COVID, did your clientele base increase or did you see like any major kind of problems during that?
Yes, that's a great question. So I would say that, like most therapists, I did see a pretty big increase in demand for my services and
Yeah.
for therapy services in general. Um, I do think that, unfortunately, there were many consequences as a result of the pandemic. Some people were very negatively impacted, as we all know, some people more than others. And one common theme that definitely emerged throughout the pandemic was that people were noticing they were having a lot more difficulty with sleep.
Mm.
And so I did get a lot of questions, a lot of people reaching out to me regarding that. And unfortunately, I'm only one person. I wish there were more people trained in sleep as well. But hopefully, today I can provide some tips and tools to help people kind of overcome any
Definitely.
challenges they might face.
Yes. Is it kind of like a niche sort of profession or are there a lot of people who are professionals in sleep? Because it sounds like you're sort of holding down the raft.
Yeah, so for whatever reason, it is pretty niche still. I think their training has started to increase over the
Mm.
years, and there are more therapists getting training in insomnia in particular. Um, but up until now, I think we had viewed, up until maybe the last 10 years or so, we had viewed
Yeah.
insomnia as a primary medical issue rather than a
Mm.
psychological issue, or at least that's what
Interesting.
most people thought of it as.
Mm.
I think us in the mental health community had always kind of knew that it was, related to a lot of different things.
Yeah.
And so I think that that probably has a little bit to do with why you're seeing, not as many providers trained in sleep or insomnia in
Mm.
particular. But hopefully that's started to change.
Yes, definitely, especially since it's such an essential part of life. Like it's a non-negotiable.
Right.
Wonderful. So we're going to do
Right.
some get to know you questions now. This is just for the listeners and to get to know you a little bit better. So I'm just going to ask you some questions. Cool?
Sure.
Awesome. Okay, so first question, recent book you've been reading?
Yes, so I recently started reading a book called Homecoming by Dr. Tama Bryant. It's a wonderful book, highly recommend to anyone.
Gosh, what's that about?
So it's about overcoming fear and trauma and reclaiming your true, authentic self, is how she titles it. So, really about getting in touch with you and who you really are as a person, and starting to understand and recognize how maybe traumatic experiences or stressful
Mm.
experiences throughout your life may have impacted you and the way you see yourself, and starting to really kind of uncover those layers. Really, it's a lot about empowerment, which I love doing for the clients that I see as well.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. What's that one called?
Homecoming,
Homecoming. Oh, awesome.
and it's by Dr. Tama Bryant. Sorry.
Great. What is a movie you would recommend?
So I recently saw Hustle on Netflix. That's the one with Adam Sandler.
Oh,
I thought it was
yeah,
pretty interesting. Yeah, so any basketball fans out there might enjoy that one.
definitely. Highly recommend. And your favorite podcast?
So I don't have a favorite. There's so many I love out there.
Yeah,
But one that I often listen to is the
there are
Meta
so many good
Hour
ones.
podcast.
Oh,
Yeah, tons
okay.
of good ones. Yeah, the Meta Hour is Sharon Salzberg, and this is more about meditation and mindfulness.
Oh, awesome. And who is your favorite famous role model or favorite role model?
That one's also hard for me to pick. I think Michelle Obama is definitely one, Oprah
Yeah.
Winfrey, and my mentors from graduate school. Maybe they're not quite as famous on the worldwide scale, but I would say that they're up there too.
Oh, still, no, that's so gorgeous. Yeah, Michelle and Oprah are definitely in my like top 5. Michelle's book is so incredible. Have you read it?
Yes, yes, for sure.
It's so great. It's, yeah, becoming. For people who haven't read it, go read it right now. And what is a course you have completed?
So I wouldn't say it was a full course that I took recently, but I did take an acceptance and commitment therapy kind of mini course with Stephen Hayes, who's the founder of that therapy. The shortened version is ACT. And it's used for a lot of different ailments, like insomnia for one, and
Mm.
stress, depression, things like that.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you for answering those questions. So, we're going to get into the sort of nitty gritty of it now. We're going to talk about sleeping, which is such, like I said before, an essential part of life. It's so crucial because humans just, nobody can operate without it. Animals, humans, it's all something that we need to digest things, to help ourselves feel better, to look after ourselves. It's such a essential part of who we are. Um, but for our listeners, Nicole, because this podcast is about productivity and we're going to talk about how sleep affects that and how you can sleep productively, how would you define productivity?
Yeah, so for me, the way I personally define it is, am I able to do the things that I need to do or want to do throughout the day? For the most part, of
Mm,
course, there are going to be things that will come up for
yeah.
all of us that can get in the way. But yeah, am I able to meet my own personal goals that I might have, and really kind of staying in line with what I value and
Mm.
what's most important to me, and trying to stay true to that.
Yeah, definitely. I really like that definition. I think most people start with the input output thing, which is like obviously comes into that and is such a crucial part to that definition. But yeah, being able to actually meet your own kind of criteria and your own standards and helping that sort of align with your values and your morals. I think that's such an interesting take on that. But what do you think people get wrong when it comes to personal productivity?
Yeah, so for me, I think, and I was probably getting this wrong for a long time in my life as well. It relates to how I view productivity. Is are you are you living for what other people think you should be doing and what other people think productive is, or are you living for your own version of what
Mm.
productivity is?
Yeah.
Because if you're not, the chances are you're going to burn out really quickly, and you're going to find yourself feeling pretty stressed, and you're going to find yourself having trouble sleeping as well. And so I really think it's important to take a look at what's most important to you and how you can find balance in your life as well.
Mhm.
Because otherwise, there's going to be a hit on other areas of your life. So that's kind of how I personally view it.
Yeah, definitely. And now we're going to talk a bit about how sleep and productivity intertwine. What does it mean to have productive sleep? Or is there such thing? Like, can you have a productive sleep?
Yeah, so that reminds me of a question that I actually commonly get from very busy people who are typically very high achieving or overachieving. They want to try to maximize their sleep as much as they can.
Yeah.
Um, the answer is, there's kind of like a yes and no to that. Like, yes, you can make your sleep more efficient, and that actually is really important. But you don't want to
Okay.
be placing too much emphasis on that, because
Yeah.
anytime you put too much pressure on sleep, chances are your sleep is actually going to unfortunately take a hit as a result, and you're going to see that it's going to be harder to sleep.
Yeah,
But yeah,
definitely.
so when you're thinking about sleep, it's most important to think about your sleep quality, not
Mm.
the quantity. So really the quality of your sleep, meaning,
Interesting. Yeah.
um, yeah, are you getting solid uninterrupted sleep? Because otherwise, then it's going to really impact the sleep phases that you're entering, the architecture of your overall sleep, and you're going to notice is you're not going to feel as great during the day.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's so interesting that you mention that as the question that you get asked all the time, because it is something that you think about, sort of like, okay, like I need to maximize my ability to sleep sort of productively, whatever that means, so that I can
Mhm.
be more productive during the day, that I can, be more energetic, I could be more high functioning. And obviously, yes, those things intertwine, but it's almost like a stress, like, oh my gosh, like I'm not gonna sleep, like it's not gonna work. And I know, and I'm sure so many people can relate to this. You're sort of like lying there and you're like, okay, I have to fall asleep now to be able to get this many hours, or I have to fall asleep now
Mhm.
so that I can be energetic. And it's like a stress and it's not helping. Like at no
Yes,
point during that you can't just be like,
exactly.
oh, I need to fall asleep now. And your body's like, yeah, okay, let's let's do that.
100% spot on. Yeah, I wish we could will ourselves to sleep, but unfortunately we can't.
Exactly. Oh my gosh, that would be a godsend for parents.
Right, right.
So, how do you think sleep influences an individual's productivity?
Yeah, so I want to be careful with answering this question. And that's only because, I do tend to see a lot of people who have insomnia. And so they're already
Yeah.
very stressed out about their sleep and how it's impacting them during the day.
Yeah.
So, I first want to put out that disclaimer that sleep is not the be all and end all. And just because you have a bad night of sleep, it doesn't mean you're doomed the next day or the rest of your life.
Yeah.
There are other things that factor into your productivity, not just your
Yeah.
sleep. That being said, of course, sleep can impact your productivity, especially
Mm.
for those who are kind of accustomed to whether it's intentional or not. Maybe sometimes some people need to do this, but some people will kind of burn the candle at both ends, and they'll tend
Yeah.
to stay up really late, working really late, and they find that they're sleeping less and less over time. That's going to take a hit, especially your productivity is going to be affected, especially if you've been
Mm.
doing this for longer than a few months at a time. You're going
Yeah.
to start to notice that your attention, your concentration is going to start to wane. You're not going to feel as focused during the day.
Mm.
Maybe your emotion regulation is going to be a little more difficult. So you might find yourself feeling a little more irritable than you normally are. It's going to impact quite a lot. But again, just making sure we're kind of keeping it in balance in that, that's not the only thing that's going to affect how you're feeling during the day, but it is definitely quite important.
Yeah, I think it's such an important question to answer in a way that doesn't sort of manipulate the material, because obviously your productivity is going to be so affected by your sleep, but then you can't put all that pressure on it and all that weight on it. So
Mhm.
that kind of leads into my next question. A very faulty misconception about sleep is that you can actually catch up on missed sleep and sort of compensate for it. So, what is your take on people sort of who try to compensate for sleep, or try to nap throughout the day so that they can sort of, get all the sleep that they feel like they need?
Yeah, that's another great question. So, You're right in that you can't really catch up on sleep in the long run. However, there is some leeway there. So, how I like to think of it is you can kind of think of how you're sleeping overall week by week. So if your overall average throughout 1 week is
Yeah.
where it needs to be, you're okay. You can kind of make up for it within that week. But anything beyond that, it's probably going to be a little more difficult to
Yeah.
compensate. Um, to address your question about, maybe some people compensate by, I think you said taking naps in
Yeah, like
particular. Is that
taking a
right?
nap during the day.
Yeah. So it's really going to depend on the person. For the most part, if you are someone who is struggling with insomnia, meaning you consistently are experiencing difficulty sleeping at least 3 times a week or more
Yeah.
for at least 3 months or longer, and you're having either trouble falling asleep or staying
Mhm.
asleep, or maybe your sleep is restless, quality is not good. Um, Napping is actually really not recommended in those instances. And the reason for that is, the more sedentary we are during the
Yeah.
day and the longer naps we take, it's really then going to cut into what we call our homeostatic sleep drive. And that's one of
Okay.
only two things that really controls our sleep.
Yeah.
And so, as a result of that, if you've ever taken a nap pretty close to your bedtime, especially, you would have noticed this. It's going to push back then when you fall asleep
Yeah,
later
definitely.
on, right?
Mm.
And so we really want to be careful if we're having trouble sleeping not to go to napping, because
Yeah.
then it's going to end up being this kind of endless loop, right? Of,
Yeah.
sleeping only a few hours at night and then taking naps during the day, and
Yeah.
then your schedule's going to get kind of all messed up. That being said, there are some cultures where biphasic sleep happens. So you have two separate sleeps perhaps, and that might work for
Interesting.
you. And
Yeah,
maybe
okay.
your work schedule is set up in that way so that it
Yeah.
works fine. So I'm always careful around that. I want to kind of see what is your current lifestyle like and what's really
Mm.
going to work best for you.
Yeah.
But in general, that's not something we want to do. It tends to not work out.
Yeah, definitely. I think I've, like, never been a nap person. Like, it's just sort of not who I am because I figure, like, okay, if I'm, like, tired now and I get to the end of the day, I know that I'm gonna fall asleep, so I'm like, "Okay, like, I'm gonna kind of, like, not take advantage of this, but sort of use it to my advantage." Yes, to take advantage of it, essentially, to be able
Yes.
to fall asleep later. So, I've always been so fascinated. Like, I have a friend who he takes a nap, like, every single
Mm-hmm.
day without question. But
Mm-hmm.
then I'm like, "Well, you're always tired." So I'm kind of
Uh-huh.
wondering, so do you take naps? Like, is it something that you have participated in?
So for me personally, I don't. I mean, of course, when I was a lot younger, like a teenager, yeah, that teens are
Yeah.
probably napping quite a bit because for other reasons, their
Yeah.
school schedule is typically not set up to meet their own biological rhythm correctly, and so
Mm,
then they're
yeah.
compensating, and that's a whole other issue. But I generally, yeah, I won't take a nap because of what you just said, because I know, if I save it up, then at nighttime I'm going to have really
I'm
good
gonna
sleep drive. My
sleep.
sleep
Yeah.
quality is going to be good.
Yeah.
Exactly. So let's better to kind of wait it out. And that's how I personally do it. But
Yeah.
again, if it's working for you, then great. But if it's not,
Yeah.
then we want to take a look at it and see if we can modify anything.
Interesting, because my next question ties into this sort of taking, like, naps or new thing called sleep breaks. So
Mm-hmm.
there's been research where some companies have implemented sleep breaks into their lunch breaks. So they'll give you sort of like your
Mm-hmm.
30-minute lunch break and then a 30-minute sleep break. What are your thoughts on this? Like, do you think that this is a good idea, or do you think that this can be kind of dangerous in terms of sort of separating your work life and your home life and how your body adjusts to sort of sleeping conditions? And I'm really interested because I think
Right.
for me personally, I don't. I could not do this. I definitely could not do this. The only
Yeah.
time I could ever nap or sleep
somewhere that was not my own house was when I was in like kindergarten, and it was something that you did in the middle of the
Right,
day.
right.
Like when I was like 4 and it
Exactly.
was so required. But
Right, right,
now,
right.
like in my 20s, I'm like, oh my goodness, like there's
Mhm.
no way I could, in the office and then like go lay down in like a hub, like those things they have at Google.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on this? Like, do you think this is like a new trend? Do you think this is something people should implement?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've seen that a lot too. I've gotten this question a lot from different companies I've consulted with as
Mm,
well. And this is another one where it depends, unfortunately.
yeah.
So if if companies are doing that because they're requiring people to stay up late and push their boundaries
Mm.
around work and be on 24/7, and that's their way of kind of saying, oh hey, cover up for that.
Yeah.
I don't like that. I don't think
Yeah.
that's a good idea. It's not good for anyone. um, However, I think if we can kind of see it as like maybe you have the option, like flex time, you have the option to take a nap if you like, because
Yeah.
30 minutes is actually a good window of time if you are going to take a nap, because it's kind
Mm.
of that, for most people, a sweet spot where it's not too much so that it's then really cutting into your sleep drive, and then also you're kind of feeling a bit lethargic right after you wake up, so
Yeah.
you're not experiencing that, but it's enough to get a little bit of a boost. And so for some people who are sleeping well at night, and they're getting sufficient quality and quantity sleep, and if they want to then
Mm.
take that nap and that feels good for them, then
Yeah.
great. For other people who are having sleep problems, that's not going to be a good idea.
Yeah.
And also, for some people, they might not need it. So maybe they want to use
Yeah.
that time to do a meditation or to do some yoga or to do something else, just to
Mm.
rest and kind of separate themselves from work. So it has pros and cons. And I think it's really going to depend on the company and their overall culture and how they're framing this and what else are they
Mm.
doing besides
Yeah.
this. What are things like?
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
and that could kind of, yeah, it's not a yes or no for me strictly at this point.
Yeah, exactly. I think we've kind of figured that out so far in this sort of 20 minutes. It's like
Right.
sleep is such a sort of like, well, it depends, It's like when you ask a lawyer a
Yes.
question, they're gonna be like, well, it depends, there's different factors and
Exactly.
how that sort of goes into it. Um, but I think during COVID, this is something that
Mhm.
I saw come up a lot in terms of separating your space from your workspace and then sort of like your home
Yes.
space where you sleep. And, you hear these
Mhm.
things like, like when you're at university, they're like, don't work in bed, don't like, use your
Yes.
laptop when you're in
Mhm.
bed or that kind of thing. So
Yeah.
when it comes to sort of like these workplaces that are now implementing sleep breaks, I'm like, okay, how does that work? Do you think that sleep should remain within the home setting? Like, do you think it needs to be something where people sort of need to carve out boundaries in terms of like where they sleep, in terms of don't sleep at your desk, make sure you sleep in your bed so that you have that defined kind of
Yes.
space? Like, what's your opinion on that?
Yes, that's an excellent point. So, in general, that is the guideline, that we want to leave sleep, only sleep in your bed, and sleep only in your bed too. So, um, if you can build a very strong connection between your bed and sleep,
Yeah.
that's going to be really important in maintaining your sleep quality and quantity.
Okay.
And so, yeah, like you were saying, it's sometimes maybe taking a nap outside of where you normally sleep is, for people who generally sleep well, should be fine. It shouldn't be a problem. But if you're noticing that you have a history of being a kind of poor sleeper, you really want to try to be as strict as you can, but also giving yourself some flexibility. Of course, we don't want to take it to the other extreme where we're kind of feeling like we have to rigidly adhere to every single rule so much
Yeah.
so that it's negatively impacting other areas of our life. But yeah, it's all about just kind of keeping it in balance. But yeah, we want to try to maintain that rule as much as we can.
Yeah, I find it so interesting. Is there like a specific psychology behind it in terms of like your body goes to like when you go to bed, your brain's like, oh yes, this is the space. Like, is it that kind of like your brain identifies
Yes.
it as a place where you sleep, or is it like Like, how does that work?
Absolutely. Great question. Yeah. So it's exactly what you said. So it works on these classical conditioning principles. That's how we
Yeah.
refer to it in psychology, where, if you are pairing your bed with sleep, especially and falling asleep quickly and not doing
Mhm.
anything else in your bed but sleep other than
Yeah.
being intimate, maybe, then your brain is going to very strongly link that place with sleep. And
Mm.
so that it will
Yeah.
help you to sleep better. On the other hand, if you're doing other things, watching TV, eating, staying up on your phone, it's going to confuse your brain a bit. So
Mm.
our brain is kind of always looking for shortcuts to simplify things because there's
Yeah.
so much we have to retain at any given moment, right? And so
Yeah.
the more it can simplify pathways, the easier, less mental load we'll have. And so that's kind
Yeah.
of why, this basic principle will work.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, like they tell us that a lot when you're at university. Sort of make sure you have that boundary, and especially during COVID, like it was so important. That
Yeah.
I didn't work in my bed because then it just became like a second couch kind of situation,
Mhm.
which is not
Mhm.
great. Um, but anyway, the next question I wanted to ask sort of revolves more around this sort of like efficient sleeping or sleep productivity. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
research has
Mhm.
shown that somebody can operate better during the day if they've obtained a sufficient level of sleep, and you can perform better and you're more productive because you've fulfilled sort of like your bodily need. When it
Mhm.
comes to sort of your professional life and the employer employee sort of relationship, what are some
Mhm.
ways employers can help or encourage their employees to get the right amount of sleep to ensure that their productivity is consistent and that they're able to come to work sort of like as their best selves?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it relates back to what I was saying earlier. The how can the company set an overall workplace culture and environment where there are very strict boundaries around work
Yeah.
and personal leisure time, right? So, setting an example from the highest level of, this is when we're all signing off. Of course, some companies might need to have services where certain people are on call and working in shifts
Mm.
and things like that. But overall, giving people the time and the space they need to be able to take care of themselves and really treating it as a priority. So, not having this expectation that people are going to sign on for a second shift, when they get home, or after dinner or something like that, right? Because that really is then going to cut into rest time and sleep
Yeah.
time. And the thing is, we're most of us kind of know that for kids, if you think about putting a kid to sleep, right, you want to kind of read them a bedtime story and brush their
Yeah, it's
teeth
a it's
and
a process.
do a whole bedtime routine. Exactly, right? And we kind of forget how important that is as adults, but we need that too. We can't
Mm.
go from working to all of a sudden 5 minutes later expecting ourselves to be asleep. That's not going to work. We need to have a buffer zone of at least 45 minutes at the bare minimum to really be able to disconnect from work. And
Really?
some people need way more than that. Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
so
Otherwise, our
interesting.
brain's going to keep going, and
Yeah.
we're going to be too stimulated, and we're not going to be able to sleep. Or we might wake up in the middle of the night, and then our brain's going, and we can't fall back asleep.
Yeah. I think that's so interesting. Just going back to what you said before in terms of that buffer time, because when you do think about it, you
Mhm.
put your kid to sleep and it is such a process. Like, besides, trying to get them
Mhm.
to brush their teeth or, those kinds of
Mhm.
things, or
Mhm.
actually get dressed into their pajamas, which is a whole adventure. Um,
Mhm.
when it comes to that it is such a process, and you sort of take that time to calm them down and sort of get them into that sort of space that a lot of the time you're like, okay, this is making it easier for me, but it's also making it easier for them to kind of calm down and sort of, settle
Mhm.
down in those sort of terms,
Mhm.
and fall into sleep. And as
Mhm.
adults, I think, like, obviously we don't do that a lot for ourselves. And you mentioned
Mhm.
having that 45-minute sort of buffer time. How is that? How does that buffer time work? Like, is that sort of 45 minutes, after I've stopped looking at my phone? Or is it sort
Mhm.
of like, like taking a shower and brushing your teeth? Like, sort of what is that 45 minutes supposed to look like? Or that sort of space between, sort of work and sleep? What's that space supposed to look like?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The phone question. I get that one constantly.
Yes, I'm
As you
so
can imagine,
curious. Yeah,
we're all addicted to our phones. It's okay. I
exactly.
understand. Um, you probably know what I'm going to say.
Yeah.
Obviously, ideally, it would be better not to be on your phone at least 45 minutes before your bedtime. There are a few reasons for that. One is the blue light that's emitted from your devices. That's similar to the same kind of light we receive from the sun. The sun is what
Mm.
helps kind of set our biological clock and tells us when it's time to feel most alert and when it's time to feel most sleepy. And so that's going to kind of interfere with things.
Yeah.
Of course, there are now, blue light blocking kind of glasses, and also you can set the night shift mode on your phone. That's going to protect you somewhat from that. But beyond that, typically people who are on their phones at night, they're usually on social media, there might be answering work
Yeah.
emails. All those things are going to really start to stimulate you again and kind of get your
Yeah.
brain going. So unless you're using it to really wind down and you do notice that
Mm.
it helps you to feel more at peace and calm, if that's working for you, go for it. But if you're noticing like that, it's kind of hard to put the phone down, or
Yeah.
I'm wrapped up in looking at TikTok for like an hour at a time. It's probably a good
Yeah.
idea to start practicing, like, okay, this is, maybe I'm going to set an alarm, like this is my
Yeah.
absolute latest where I'm going to have this on, and I'm going to be intentional about setting it aside. If I need to put it in another room, I'm going to put it in another room, right? Whatever you need to do to kind of have that boundary. And yeah, from there, of course, no work during that time. You want to be spending that time doing things as relaxing as possible. So
Yeah.
it looks different for different people. Some people like to take a warm shower or bath. Some people like to have a skincare routine. Some people like to, light incense or do
Yeah.
a meditation or do some gentle stretching or read something, or you could even watch an episode of something light and funny.
Yeah.
Don't watch the news. That's probably not a good idea at that time.
Yeah.
But just something simple, something
Mm.
easy. And the more you can kind of get into a routine and find what works for you, the more actually engaging in this routine actually starts to also cue your brain that, oh, okay, this means sleep is coming soon.
Yeah. That's what I was going to ask you in terms of, does having that routine and sort of those patterns that you do before you go to sleep, does that help sort of prepare your body to fall asleep faster? Like, is that something that you'd recommend people sort of putting in kind of like a bit of a routine, whether it's sort of like little like trigger points for your brain where it's kind of like, okay, like everybody sort of prepare to shut everything down.
Yes, you got it. Absolutely. So the more you can identify a routine, and it doesn't need to be too complicated. Maybe it's only like two things that you're
Yeah.
doing. But, if you need to do more, you need to do more. Um, the more you can identify that, the better, yeah, the better you will find yourself sleeping overall.
Yeah. Do you have like sort of things that do you have like sort of like little trigger points? Because I know I have like maybe like one or two. Do you sort of have ones where you're like your body's like, yes, okay, like this is what we're preparing for it?
Yes, yes. So for me, I need to give myself at least an hour and a half of wind down.
Yeah, wow.
I am a little more night owl oriented by nature,
Yeah.
and a lot of people are. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's your biology. You just need to learn how to work with it. If that's the case, like if you're finding like naturally you are more of a night person, then you actually, if you want to be up earlier, it's really important that you do give yourself even more of a
Yeah.
buffer zone period. So even up to 2 hours of this buffer zone period.
Yeah.
So, I will do my shower. I'll have, skincare routine, brushing teeth,
Mm.
things like that. And then I will either read for 30 minutes or so,
Mm.
or I'll watch an episode of just like a funny, like usually like a
Yeah.
adult, like cartoon show or something like
Yeah.
that. Just something that doesn't get me thinking about stuff.
Yeah.
And typically, actually, I forgot, before that, I'll also, before any of this, I'll also write down, any remaining to-dos or anything I have on my mind to kind of empty my brain out.
Yeah.
That really helps, especially for those who find themselves like thinking a lot or waking up in the middle of the night thinking about like, oh, I have this, that, and other thing to do. Giving yourself an opportunity to really empty your brain out before bed helps to prevent that from coming up then during your sleep
Yeah.
period.
Does that kind of tie into like people having like a diary, like journaling, like and doing those kinds of things before sleep? Is
Yeah.
that sort of like what that would be?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. So journaling is great. So many benefits. A lot of people don't like writing. You don't necessarily have to write. You can audio record yourself speak if you prefer doing that.
Yeah.
Electronically write down notes. It doesn't have to be long either. 10 or 15 minutes, just taking a look at, what do I have going on in my schedule? What do I need to do tomorrow? Do I need to problem solve anything? So
Yeah.
that I'm not, again, up thinking about it in the middle of the night.
Interesting. And you mentioned before sort of like you're more of a night person. I'm
Mhm.
more of a night person, used to be more of a morning person when I was like younger in high school. But now I'm probably more of a night
Mhm.
person. I feel like most adults kind of go into that weird sort of like switch over.
Mhm.
What are like some signs or what should people sort of look out for in terms of figuring out whether they operate better at different times to help adjust their sleep? Like I know my dad wakes up at like the crack
Mhm.
of dawn and like has to.
Mhm. Mhm.
Like it's just sort of like
Mhm.
his body clock, he operates better at that time. Like my dad shuts off at like 6, 7 o'clock. And after that, like he's just he's not comprehensible. Whereas my mom is the complete opposite. It takes her a really long time to get started in the morning and therefore she
Mhm.
sort of adjusts her sleep. Um,
Mhm.
what are some things that people should sort of maybe look for or little signs or how can they know? Because I feel like there's such a people like, oh, you have to get up early and sort of like maybe miss out on some sleep or sort of adjust your sleep pattern to be your most productive self. How do
Yeah.
people know what kind of sleep pattern or sort of time schedule is going to be most productive for them?
Yeah, yeah, great question. So there are a few ways. There are some really great quizzes online if you just want to Google, like, find my chronotype or, my biological rhythm type.
Yeah.
They can ask kind of detailed questions about, like, when do you find yourself to be most productive? Like, if you were going to take a big exam, for example, like, what time of day would
Yeah.
you be taking it? Like, early in the morning, mid morning, late
Oh,
afternoon,
interesting.
something like
Yeah.
that. Yeah, so just to kind of can get us. And some people, though, they're not sure, and so we might need to do a little more detective work from there.
Mm.
So another kind of way to gauge it is maybe think about the last time that you were on vacation, and you didn't have to be up at any given time. Like, when did you
Yeah.
find yourself naturally waking up? And this is, depends on what kind of vacation you're taking. Sometimes people will take
Yeah.
one and they're up super early to do some kind of crazy excursion or things
Yeah.
like that. But if you have like a week or so of, you don't have anything scheduled, and just kind of allowing yourself to see when you naturally getting up, that can be kind of like a gauge of, okay, if I'm getting up around 7, maybe that means I'm, in the kind of usual, what we say usual range. Although, again, it varies from person to person.
Mm.
If you're more of like, 10 o'clock seems to be the time, or later, even
Yeah.
when I naturally wake up and feel really good, that might mean that you are more of an evening type person. You can also take a look at, when are you naturally noticing that you're getting sleepy.
Yeah.
So again, it's hard for some people because sometimes they're forced into work schedules that require them to get up a
Yeah.
lot earlier than would naturally feel
Mhm.
good for them. And so, we really trying to kind of see, like, when you're not scheduled for anything, what actually comes up. You can even keep a journal. So regularly with my clients, I have them actually keep what's called a sleep diary, and it's just
Mm.
a subjective measure of how you think you're sleeping. And you can write on there, when did I notice myself
Yeah.
getting sleepy? And after about a week or two of data, you can start to notice some patterns and kind of get a sense of yourself. So it's really about just building that inner awareness as much as possible.
Yeah, definitely. And it's such a hard sort of thing to monitor or maintain because, yeah, a lot of the time you sort of your work schedule forces you to get up at certain times. I know like if I get up any earlier than 7, I suffer. Like it's not an enjoyable experience. I naturally get up around like 9:30ish, which for so many of my friends is so late. Like they're so outraged by it. They're like, Tia, how could you wake up like, after 8 a.m. because they get up at like 7 a.m. And it's just sort of like their natural thing. Whereas I'm like, oh, like I usually sleep until 9:30, 10 a.m. And for me, it doesn't feel like a sleep in. Like I get up and I feel like, like, okay, I had the amount of sleep that I needed or I felt I needed. And that's usually because I fall asleep around like, 11:30. And I feel like I need a very kind of long time to sleep. And that kind of brings me to my next question. How many hours of sleep do people need, or would you recommend for them to, be efficient and productive in their daily life?
Yeah, another very common question. And I would say, unfortunately, for this one, it also depends. So
Yeah.
we often, I think we hear this like 8 hours. It's this like myth of this magical number that everyone should strive for 8 hours.
Yeah.
That's not true. Um, the usual range for most people is somewhere between 7 to 9 hours. Some people will fall a little bit outside of that range too. That doesn't mean
Yeah.
there's anything wrong with you. It just depends on you personally. Um, the best way to kind of figure this out is to see, how many hours of solid sleep are you getting where that is enough to carry you throughout the day to do the things that you need to or want to do during
Yeah.
the day to remain productive, in other words. And that will be your number. So it might take a little bit of kind of examining, like, keeping track of your sleep using that sleep diary that I was mentioning until you
Yeah.
figure out what personally feels right for you. Because for some people, 7 hours is enough. For other people, they need up to 10. It really
Yeah.
depends. So, but what I really want people to kind of take away from this is that your quality is actually going to be much more important than your quantity. So,
Yeah.
if you're getting 9 hours of really choppy sleep, getting a few hours here and there, that's actually not going to do as much for you as maybe 6 to 7 hours of really solid sleep where of course it's natural to wake up in the middle of the night, but you're not up for longer than a few minutes at a time.
Yeah. Ah, that's so interesting. So, my next question is sort of you have mentioned sleep quality over quantity. And to care for your sleep quality, you have to have sort of good sleep hygiene. So, what are your sort of top 3 tips, maybe, on good sleep hygiene, in particular for people who are very busy and maybe don't have a consistent sleep schedule?
Yeah, so a lot of my tips are ones that I've already mentioned, but I'll see if I can give some more. But sleep hygiene, I just want to say that's kind of like the basics, where you want to make sure you're hitting that no matter what. But if you have a problem like insomnia, sleep hygiene is not going to be enough to address it. So I just
Yeah.
want to put that out there. Um, but other than that, of course, having that wind down period really important. You want to make sure you're protecting that 45 minutes to hour and a half, 2 hours before bed.
Mm,
Maybe you want to kind of keep that journal, right, that I was saying. Um, Maybe you also, what would be important that it's not actually in really the sleep hygiene realm. It's more so in the kind of sleep drive or biological clock realm. We
yeah.
want to try to actually get up at the same time every day if we can. This one might be a bit tricky for people who are night owls who have to keep an early bird or morning lark
Yeah.
schedule. They find that they might need to sleep in on the weekend. If that works for them, they're not having trouble sleeping, that's totally fine. But if you're having some trouble with sleep, it's going to be really important to try to get up and start your day at the same time every day. Every
Mm,
time you get up, your biological clock resets. And so we want to make sure that's staying consistent and regular.
yeah.
Otherwise, your clock will get really confused. So trying to get up around the same time every day is super important. I would also say that trying to get exercise is really important as well. Of course, things have started to open back up a lot. Of depends, where you are in the world, of course. And so now people are able to get out more. But during the pandemic, I think that was other than what you said of, a lot of people were forced to work from home, and that also disrupted the sleep environment. People were not as active as they used to
Mm.
be, and so that was
Yeah,
also affecting
definitely.
sleep. So it's really important for you to move your body as much as you're able to during the day, because that helps to build up your sleep drive as well. So the more active you are, the better sleep you're going to get. The better sleep you're going to get, the more energy you'll have for workouts or
Yeah.
any kind of activity that you're doing. So they
Yeah.
really go hand in hand. So those would be some of my top ones.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, exercise, so many benefits. I think you can't go
Mhm.
wrong with, at least like 30 minutes of exercise. It has, and I do notice that I do get a better quality of sleep when I do sort of exercise on a more regular basis because I am more tired when I do, like
Mhm.
when my head sort of hits the pillow, my body is like, we are so ready. Like we are ready to fall asleep now. So yes, definitely. Thank you for those tips.
Mhm.
So we're going to dive into sort of your personal practice and habit sort of debrief. This is a sort of where, the listeners get to find out what do the experts do when it comes to sort of their area. You're always curious sort of like, what is it that the experts do when it comes to their profession and sort of their area of productivity. So my first question is, what is the practice that you do to improve your sleep quality that in essence sort of affects your personal productivity?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I probably have already mentioned a lot of the big ones, right? So, one was to get up at the same time every day. So I try to practice that for the most part. Of course, here and there, once a week at most, if I need to sleep in for whatever reason, I've been at an event. I will give myself some leeway around that, right? Because some things are more important than sleep. That's okay.
Yeah.
Um, Other than that, I also have the wind down practice that I implement. I try to engage in some sort of relaxation strategy at least once a day. So I will either do
Mhm.
a meditation or I'll do
Okay,
some
yeah.
yoga or maybe I'll take some deep breaths. I have the journaling practice. I'm often quite busy during the day as well. But I've learned that, the more I practice my own self care, the better quality work I can do.
Yeah.
Right. And that's really what's most important to me. So I try to kind of emphasize, kind of think about, what are my energy levels like, right? Check in with
Mm.
myself. If I'm feeling depleted, then that means I need to rearrange some things. I need to give myself more time to do the things that re-energize me. Otherwise,
Yeah.
I'm not going to be able to keep doing this work. And so I would say those are kind of like my biggest go-to practices for myself.
Mm. Are there any challenges that you face, like when you do this, especially sort of waking up at the same time every morning? Like, are there any challenges that you sort of had to overcome with that?
Sure. I mean, like most people, especially those who are night owls, if they're finding they want to maintain a bit of an earlier schedule, and I tend to want to maintain somewhat of an earlier schedule. Although I have my own business, and so I'm able to kind of set my own schedule, which does help offset some of that.
Yeah.
But there was an adjustment period, certainly in the beginning of trying to kind of get up at an earlier hour. And so, I just had to remind myself that the more I stick with this and the more consistent I can be with it, the more it's going to pay off in the long run. And so, really just kind of some self motivation around it that, it's the more you struggle right now, the more payoff you'll see in the
Yeah.
end. So, if you could just kind of remind yourself, just stick with it, it'll get better over time. It
Yeah.
typically does. You just need to give yourself some time and patience. And again, if you fall off here and there, no need to be harsh with yourself around that.
Yeah.
That's not going to help anyone. Right.
Yeah,
So just giving
definitely.
yourself some compassion and some
Yeah.
motivation, that's kind of my go-to.
So you mentioned some sort of like self care practices in terms of like journaling and meditating. Do you carve out time sort of like in your schedule specifically for these things, or are they just sort of like spur of the moment?
Yeah, so typically when I'm working during the week, I will intentionally carve out time for that. So I will have the hours that
Yeah.
I'm working, and then I will have the hours that I'm not. And I try to stick to that for the most part. Of course, sometimes there are emergencies, we can't always predict what's going to happen. But, for the most part, I will really try to stick with that. Otherwise, then it's going to become harder and harder to maintain. I know that from my own personal experience
Yeah.
that works for me to have
Yeah.
some separation there.
Yeah, definitely. So, would you recommend sort of like meditation and journaling? Like, do you think it's something that like everybody should implement in their lives? Not every, I know journaling's not for everybody, but maybe
Mhm, mhm.
meditation. Do you think it's something that sort of the general population should practice for their own benefit?
Yeah, so I never like to say it should, because I think everyone is different and there will be different strategies that work for different people, and that's totally fine.
Yeah.
Some people, when they hear about meditation, they already have like a really averse kind of reaction to that. And
Yeah.
it's okay, I understand that. But it might also be because of, misconceptions around like what meditation and mindfulness is and what idea they have around it. I think really even having some informal mindfulness in your life can be beneficial to anyone. So
Mm,
what I mean by that is trying as best as you can to practice being in the present moment, and to be non-judgmental and have hold compassion for yourself in addition
yeah.
to that. And it's so tricky, believe me, I know it's not easy. It's easier said than done, but
Yeah.
just strive for that, and to know you're never going to be perfect. It's not about reaching some sort of zen place where you've like magically cleared out every thought. That's not possible. That's not what we're striving for. But just to
Mm,
just notice, what is the self talk like? Most of us
yeah.
are our own worst critics. There's a lot of inner critic dialogue going on. And so just to kind of build some awareness around that, and to also be able to hold some compassion, typically can help us to bring ourselves more peace and ease. And again, also
Mm.
be more productive and sleep better. And also, hopefully be better to the people in our lives that we love.
Exactly, exactly. So, based on your experience, do you have any other recommendations of practices that you would combine with this, or sort of ways to improve on this particular practice?
Yeah, so like I was mentioning, there are many different kinds of strategies. So if you are experiencing insomnia, the main treatment that tends to work for most people is something called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. It's based off cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's a specific treatment just for insomnia, and a lot of it is part of what we've been talking about today. So there's a lot of education around sleep and what controls sleep. Um, you know, First we want to look at sleep hygiene too, that we were saying, like what are the things that you're doing and what are
Mm,
the things you're not doing? What do we need to work on? And then we take a deeper dive into some of the more specific tools. So for some people, they are spending a really long time in bed for a pretty low rate of return. Like, for example, some people think, I need to give myself 10 or 11 hours in bed because it takes me, 3 or 4 hours to
yeah.
fall asleep. So I have to give myself extra time. And
Yeah.
that's understandable, right? Because, that would be most people's first thought.
Yeah.
However, what we know is the more you do that, the more one, you are conditioning yourself to think of your bed for not sleeping, for being awake and maybe even
Interesting.
tossing and
Yeah.
turning. And also, two, you are reducing your sleep drive, right?
Yeah.
Because you're laying down, you're not active at that time. And so it actually ends up being unhelpful in the long run. And so, part of one of the main things that we might do for someone who's having trouble sleeping is to actually reduce the amount of time that they're spending in bed initially, in order to help them build up their sleep drive more, and in order to have them hopefully have a better association with their bed and falling asleep quickly over time.
Interesting.
And so that would be another kind of big one for
Yeah.
people to kind of think about. So like, for example, for me, if I'm having an off week, which will happen to everyone from time to time, and I'm noticing that maybe there's been 2 nights in a row where I've had some disrupted sleep, I've had difficulty falling asleep, or I woke up in the middle of the night unexpectedly, and I couldn't get back to sleep after about 30 minutes. I will then the next night, after 2 nights of this happening, intentionally go to bed an hour later so that I can increase my sleep drive and
Yeah.
increase then the chances of me having more solid sleep. So it's a bit counterintuitive, but it
Interesting.
actually
Yeah.
does really work.
Oh, that's so interesting. I will definitely have to remember that because yeah,
Sure, yeah.
I am definitely that person because it takes me a hot minute to kind of sort of figure out, okay, like let's sleep, like let's actually do this now. But I think I've kind of helped myself in terms of putting in sort of like trigger points and like patterns for myself
Mhm.
before I go to sleep. But I definitely
Mhm.
need to, yeah, work on that buffer time because sometimes I only give myself like 10 minutes.
Sure. You're not alone, don't worry.
No, I know, yeah, definitely. I think it's something that everybody needs to work on because it is so important. So
Mhm.
we're going to go into audience questions now. So we've got a few
Okay.
questions here. A few of them are about deep sleep. So the first one I'm going to ask is how much does a person need deep sleep in one sleeping cycle? I think it might be helpful first, just so we understand like what is deep sleep, because I think it's sort of like a bit of a misconception. And you hear about like REM and all these kinds of things. Can you just sort of
Mhm,
explain
mhm.
first sort of what deep sleep actually is?
Yeah, yeah, great question. So, when we're talking about deep sleep, we're referring to the sleep stages. So, about every 90 minutes or so, we will all cycle through 4 different sleep stages. Some of them are lighter stages of sleep, and then we have deep sleep. And that's typically when we get the most restorative benefits, is from our stage 3 or deep sleep. And then we'll have REM that you mentioned, rapid eye movement sleep. That's when we'll do most of our dreaming. And after we go through one cycle, we actually will all wake up naturally, maybe for a few minutes, or sorry, a few seconds. But typically, these awakenings are so brief that we don't really have any memory for them. Um, for some people, however, who particularly ones who are experiencing insomnia, maybe some are having some other kind of sleep disturbance going on, they will wake up in the middle of the night and they'll stay up. And so what happens is, over time, the more time you have where you're waking up in the middle of the night, the more your sleep becomes fragmented. And so your body will then get less deep sleep than it needs and more light sleep, because every time you wake up, you will actually go through light sleep before you enter deep sleep again. So it's kind of like a cycle of light to deep and then goes back up, right? And
Yeah.
so, um, what's important to know here, this is why I was saying sleep quality is so important, because we want our sleep to be very consolidated. We want it to be very solid so that we can get enough deep sleep. Now, the amount of deep sleep that everyone needs is going to be dependent, because, like I was saying earlier, some people need less sleep, some people need more. Really, I know there are so many trackers out there that are supposedly telling you how much deep sleep versus light sleep you're getting.
Yeah.
Honestly, you got to take it with a grain of salt. Those
Yeah.
devices can't really tell whether you're in deep sleep or light sleep. The only way to really know is to do a overnight sleep study, do polysomnography. That
Yeah.
you need to have a lot of different measures that you're
Yeah.
looking at to know what stage you're in. Um, and so, we don't need to be focusing so much on that. As long as, you're not waking up for long periods, like longer than 30 minutes overall in the middle of the night, and you're noticing you feel refreshed, you have enough energy that you need to do, energy for what you need to or want to do during the day, you're fine, right? So we don't need to be so go into the nitty gritty of things as much. Just kind of take a look at how you're feeling overall during the day. If you're not feeling so great, then that might mean it's time to reach out to a sleep specialist and to kind of like dig in a little deeper and see what might be going on.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting because, yeah, I've always found, I'm like, what is like deep sleep and like, how does this work and blah, blah, blah. So you mentioned, yeah, that there's no sort of real way to accurately track it unless you've got, all that stuff attached to you and you're there and you've got all these things attached. So I guess the question that we've got is how much does a person need deep sleep in one sleep cycle? But from what you're telling me, there isn't really a way to kind of answer that question. Sort of like
really just look at it. Is your sleep solid or not, right? So if you are up for longer than 20 minutes in the middle of the night in total, that might mean that your sleep is not solid enough, and so you're maybe not getting enough deep sleep. And so you might want to start tracking your sleep and see what your patterns are. Of course, once in a while that will happen to all of us. There's no need for concern there. But if it's happening regularly, like 3 times a week or more, then that means there's probably something going on we might need to look at.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. So there's a few questions here, in terms of the relationship between feeling tired and sort of actually lacking sleep. Like, I guess out of like there's like 3 questions that are sort of related to this, so I'm trying to sort of like squish them all together.
Sure.
Does the duration of sleep affect how tired somebody is, or is it more tied to the quality? Because I think so many people, and especially I feel like when you're in your 20s, anytime you ask somebody how they are, they're like, oh, I'm so tired. Oh, I'm so tired. Oh, I'm so tired. But like, what does it mean to actually, like, how do you know when you're actually tired and you're missing out on sleep versus when you just aren't feeling so great, I guess?
Yeah. So again, that's going to be individual. But there is a difference between feeling tired and feeling sleepy. So this is something that I work on with most of the clients that I see, is that we really need to distinguish between the two, because tired could mean a lot of things. It doesn't mean necessarily that you're sleepy and that your quality is poor or that your duration is not enough.
I feel like, definitely doesn't mean that anymore.
Right. You could be stressed out, you could be recovering from a hangover. You could be not eating properly. You could be not hydrating properly. There's so many things that can go into that. And so, we don't need to just kind of only look at sleep. We need to look at the whole picture. We need to see what else is happening in your life that could be contributing to how you're feeling during the day. And sleepiness means like you're about to fall asleep at any second. Like, you cannot keep your eyes open, your head's nodding off, you're about to fall asleep. If that's happening regularly, we really need to kind of pay attention to what's going on with the sleep, because it could be insomnia, but most likely it could be that there's some other sort of sleep issue happening. And so we really want to try to kind of examine and follow up with, your healthcare providers around that.
Yeah. And our last question, so this person has said, I wake up sometimes multiple times during the night, but sometimes I will wake up and sort of, what does it say? Sorry, I'm just sort of trying to summarize it here.
Sure.
I'll wake up and I will be awake, but not entirely awake. It's almost like I'm sleepwalking, or, I think, what is it called? That sort of thing where you're awake, but you're not really awake. This person asked, when do I know, or when should I see somebody about sort of like my sleep? Like, when should I see a sleep therapist? When do I know when that's necessary? Because from the sounds of it, this person sort of like has like a sleep, like they're awake, but they're not awake. I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah, I mean, I would want to know more, of course, but I think, the fact that I want to know more already is probably telling me that it might be time for you to reach out and just see, get your specific questions answered, because it sounds like there's something you're concerned about here, right? And so we don't want to ignore that. It could be just normal. It could mean, like I was saying, there are light stages of sleep. The lightest stage of sleep, that is the stage where you're kind of drifting in and out of sleep. And so you can't really tell whether you're awake or you're asleep. And we all experience that throughout the night. And so, it could be that this person might have really interrupted sleep. They're waking up frequently. And so that means they're in light sleep more than deep sleep throughout the night. Or it could mean something else is going on. I wouldn't know. But if you're concerned about it, I think that means that's a sign that you should at least reach out for some help.
No, definitely. Yeah. I think, it's so interesting because people sort of have issues with sleepwalking or like, I think it's called like, is it like night terrors? Is that sort of like that thing where you wake up?
Night
There's so
terrors
many
can be
sort of different
one.
things. Yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of different kinds of sleep disorders. Maybe there's a REM behavior disorder. That's very rare, but it can happen. Some people will kind of act out their dreams. So
interesting.
That can be dangerous. We want to make sure to follow up. Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. I could ask you about that all day, but we'll move on. So we're just going to go into open mic now, just quickly before we finish. And this is essentially where you, as the guest, sort of get to talk about anything that you want to, any sort of like passions or anything. So it's entirely up to you, Nicole. What would you like to talk about?
Sure. I might talk about burnout a bit. I think it pretty closely relates to a lot of what we were already discussing today. I in particular, I work with a lot of healthcare providers, a lot of physicians. There has been, as a result of what's been happening, of course, over the last 2+ years now, there has been a lot more burnout, especially for healthcare workers and for everyone in general. They are finding that they are working longer hours. And when people started working from home, there wasn't as much separation. And for people who, also had childcare responsibilities or maybe taking care of elderly parents, I mean, there's been a lot of stress on us collectively. And so I just want to take some time and say that, it's really important to check in with yourself and on a regular basis and see really how you're doing. I know social media, a lot of people were throwing out there, check on your friends and family, right? But also, what about you, right? You are also important. So we really want to make sure we are taking care of ourselves. Otherwise, we cannot take care of other people, right? So we always say, put your own safety mask on first, right? If you're ever on an airplane, that's what they say, right? So just trying to kind of slow it down a bit. And of course, for some people, they might feel like they can't slow down. They might have responsibilities that, they might not have a choice, and they might feel like they don't have a choice. And of course, my heart goes out to everyone who might be in that situation. But at the very least, if you are in that situation, can you give yourself some compassion and to just know that, this might be a really hard time, but I'm going to do my best to stay true to myself and my values and try to honor myself as best as I can. And really that was kind of the main message I had out there.
Definitely. What are some signs of burnout? Because I feel like you hear about it, but a lot of people are kind of unsure of what it is, so they kind of can't identify it in themselves. Like, what are some signs of burnout?
Yeah, so there can be quite a few, but and I think it depends on the person, but noticing that maybe the quality of your work is starting to take a hit, and that you are personally feeling really taxed, really stressed, that you might even get a sense of kind of depersonalization, like not even feeling like you are yourself. And you might even notice a resentment build up towards, the people that you might be taking care of, right? Because you haven't spent enough time filling up your own cup and nurturing yourself. And so hopefully we catch it sooner rather than later, so it doesn't get to a point where it's causing other, more severe types of mental health issues, but just to kind of notice, like, how am I really functioning, right? And am I really taking care of myself the way I need to be? And again, like I said, some people feel like they might not have a choice, but often there is more choice than they are giving themselves credit for. And some of it could relate back to like some perfectionism they might struggle with. And hey, I've been
Yeah.
there. I get it.
Yeah.
I understand. Um, but at the same time, you don't need to always be saying yes to everyone and everything,
Yeah.
and you don't need to be liked by everyone. That might be coming from a deeper place, maybe rooted in some challenging experiences you had in your life. And so you might need to go back and kind of take a look at that and heal from that more so that you can kind of come back and get back in touch
Yeah.
with your true self, and make sure you are honoring yourself as much as you can.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's such, a phenomenon that we've seen sort of like take over a lot of people as of recently coming sort of like out of COVID, and it's like it's over, but it's not over, but it is, but it's not.
Mhm.
And I think every
Mhm,
country at this point is sort of dealing with it in their own kind of way. Like we've been very lucky here in Australia. It's sort of like it's subsided a lot, and people are, you know, like the healthcare system is kind of up and running again, and so things are better now, but people are still sort of recovering and expecting so much of themselves. And I just want to kind of take a bit of like a veer here, in terms of like
mhm,
parents and sort of where they
mhm,
sit in all of this, because I think COVID was specifically sort of like it was very hard for parents who maybe had younger kids who were suddenly at home
mhm,
and that sort of thing. And a lot of those parents were suffering from burnout. Do you have sort of
mhm,
any kind of like tips and tricks or just sort of recommendations for parents who are kind of struggling with sleep patterns because they have younger ones,
mhm,
or sort of
mhm.
struggling with being able to balance their professional life and their home life, sort of like post COVID and trying to figure that out?
Yeah, that's a really great point, and I have seen a lot of that as well in my own practice. I know it can be incredibly challenging for sure. And first is to try to notice whether there are any judgments you're placing on yourself around expectations and things like that. And again, I've been saying this whole time, can we try to manage that a bit better so
Mm,
there's less harshness in the way you're attending to yourself. And a lot of these parents probably will do anything for their children, right? And they're not as much thinking about themselves, but the less you spend and invest in yourself energetically, the less you will also have to give to your children. And you also have to think about what you're modeling
yeah.
for them too, right?
Yeah.
Because, if they are seeing you sacrificing everything for them all the time, you're kind of sending along a message that that's what you're supposed to do. That's how you're supposed to
Mm,
function as an adult. And
yeah,
so
yeah.
that can be passed down, right? And again, it's not from a place of judgment. I understand where the intention is coming from, but do we need to always be doing that? Probably not, right?
Mm,
There
yeah.
is something good in modeling to our children that it's also important to take care of ourselves. And of course, everyone's situation is unique, and some people might feel like they're not able to do that all the time, like single parents, for example, right? And
Yeah,
um,
definitely.
but maybe there still is more room for you than you're currently giving yourself opportunity for. And so, can
Yeah.
we try to see if there are some things we might be able to rearrange to help you to take care of yourself? Because it's really important.
Yeah, definitely. Especially, yeah, as like a parent, or if you've got kids or people that you have to look after, even if you're sure you're a caregiver, it's going to make it
Hmm.
so much harder to look after people if you're not looking after yourself. I feel like that's something that, we've always known, but it's kind of only just sort of
Sure.
clicking in, is kind of like, oh, actually,
Hmm.
I sort of have to like take care of myself first, put your own face mask on before you put somebody else's on, that kind of situation.
Right.
But yes, so important. Moral of the story, people just sort of take care of yourself and look after yourself so that you can do the same for others in return. Awesome. Well,
Mhm.
that brings us to the end of our podcast. Thank you so much, Nicole, for being here. For those who want to find out more about you and what you do, where can they go?
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure speaking with you. So you can find me online, my website at werisepsychology.com. You can also find me on Instagram at Dr Nicole M. That's Dr. Nicole M. As well as, I do have a book out there. You can purchase it on
Oh, yes.
Amazon. It talks about a lot of things we discussed today. If you're interested in more details, it's called The Book of Sleep: 75 Strategies to Relieve Insomnia.
Oh, yeah.
Available on Amazon or on Barnes and Noble, wherever you like to purchase.
Yeah. Oh, awesome. That sounds so great. Definitely have to grab a copy of that. And to our listeners, don't forget to like and subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on. And thank you again, Nicole, so much for being here. And we'll see you all next time. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
You have been listening to Work in Progress, the Personal Productivity Science Insights podcast produced by the Life Management Science Labs. Listen to episodes from LMSL's 10 Life Management Perspectives on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or other podcasting apps on your smartphone. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps others find us and us grow to bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at pp.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Tia Harmer. Thanks for tuning in.